The morning of June 6, 1944, represented the culmination of years of planning, deception, and preparation for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. For British military commanders who had fought through nearly 5 years of war, who had survived Dunkirk, who had endured the Blitz, and who had watched their nations stand alone against Nazi Germany, the sight of the Allied armada gathering for Operation Overlord was both vindication and revelation. The accounts left by British officers who witnessed the D-Day fleet provide insight not only into the scale of the operation, but also into the evolving relationship between Britain and the United States during the Second World War. To understand the significance of British reactions to the American contribution to the D-Day fleet, one must first comprehend the context in which these observations occurred. By early 1944, Britain had been at war for more than 4 years. The nation had mobilized every available resource, transforming its economy and society for total war. British shipyards had worked ceaselessly to replace vessels lost in the Battle of the Atlantic, and British factories had produced weapons, vehicles, and equipment at rates that strained the country's industrial capacity to its limits. The United States, by contrast, had entered the war in December 1941, and by June 1944, American industrial production had reached levels that astounded even the most optimistic Allied planners. The arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin Roosevelt had termed it, was functioning at a scale that exceeded anything the world had previously witnessed. The planning for Operation Overlord had begun in earnest in 1943, following the Casablanca Conference in January of that year. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his military chiefs had initially harbored reservations about a cross-channel invasion, preferring strategies that emphasized peripheral operations in the Mediterranean and potentially the Balkans. These preferences were rooted not in cowardice, but in hard-won experience. The British military establishment remembered the bloodbaths of the First World War, when British and French armies had hurled themselves against German defences with devastating results. The disaster at Dieppe in August 1942, when a raid consisting primarily of Canadian forces had been virtually annihilated, reinforced British caution about amphibious operations against fortified positions. American military leadership, particularly General George Marshall, the US Army Chief of Staff, advocated strongly for a direct approach across the English Channel into France. The Americans believed that only by confronting German military power directly in northwestern Europe could the Allies achieve decisive victory. This strategic difference created tensions within the Anglo-American alliance, though these tensions were ultimately resolved through compromise and the overwhelming logic of American material superiority. By late 1943 and early 1944, southern England had transformed into what General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, described as one vast military camp. American troops poured into Britain at an accelerating rate. By the time of D-Day, approximately 1.5 million American servicemen were stationed in the United Kingdom. The influx of American personnel, equipment, and supplies was so massive that some British observers joked that only the barrage balloons kept the island from sinking into the sea. This American presence was not without friction. The cultural differences between American and British servicemen, disputes over pay disparities, competition for the attention of British women, and occasional incidents of violence all created tensions that required careful management by commanders on both sides. Nevertheless, the professional military relationships between British and American officers were generally cordial and increasingly effective as the two forces learned to work together. The assembly of the invasion fleet for Operation Overlord, designated Operation Neptune in its naval component, represented a logistical achievement of staggering proportions. The Allied naval forces gathered for D-Day included nearly 7,000 vessels of every description. These ranged from massive battleships to tiny landing craft, from cruisers and destroyers to minesweepers and merchantmen. The fleet was divided into two main task forces. The Western Task Force, under the command of American Rear Admiral Alan Kirk, was responsible for landing American forces at Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. The Eastern Task Force, under British Rear Admiral Philip Vian, was tasked with landing British and Canadian forces at Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach. The overall naval commander was British Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who had previously distinguished himself during the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940 and had commanded naval forces during the invasions of North Africa and Sicily. Admiral Ramsay was a meticulous planner, with a reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail. He had been instrumental in developing the naval plans for Overlord, working closely with Eisenhower and the other service commanders to coordinate the immensely complex operation. Ramsay's task was to transport and land approximately 156,000 troops on the first day, along with their vehicles, equipment, and supplies, while simultaneously providing naval gunfire support and defending against German naval and air attack. The challenges were immense. The English Channel, despite its relatively short width, was notoriously treacherous, with strong tides, unpredictable weather, and limited suitable landing sites. The Germans had spent years fortifying the French coast, constructing obstacles, laying mines, and positioning artillery to create what they called the Atlantic Wall. In the months leading up to D-Day, British ports, harbours throughout southern England became staging areas for the invasion fleet. Portsmouth, Southampton, Plymouth, Weymouth, Portland, Poole, and dozens of smaller ports and anchorages were packed with vessels. The security measures were extraordinary. Entire coastal areas were sealed off from civilian access. A vast deception operation, known as Operation Fortitude, was underway to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. This deception included the creation of fictional army groups, the use of dummy equipment, carefully controlled radio traffic, and the deployment of double agents. The success of Fortitude would prove crucial to the success of Overlord, as it kept powerful German armoured formations away from Normandy in the critical early days of the invasion. British officers who served in the planning and execution of Operation Neptune left numerous accounts of their experiences. Many expressed astonishment at the scale of American contributions to the invasion fleet. Captain Stephen Roskill, who would later become the official historian of the Royal Navy in the Second World War, was serving on the planning staff for Operation Neptune. In his post-war writings, Roskill emphasized that while Britain contributed significantly to the invasion fleet, particularly in terms of escorts, minesweepers, and specialized landing craft, the sheer volume of American production was transformative. The United States had constructed landing craft and transport vessels at rates that would have been inconceivable to pre-war naval planners. American shipyards, applying mass production techniques pioneered in other industries, were launching Liberty ships and other merchantmen faster than German U-boats could sink them. By 1944, Allied shipping construction had far outstripped losses, reversing the desperate situation of 1942. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Edwards, a Royal Navy officer who participated in the Neptune planning, later wrote about the experience of watching the American fleet elements arrive in British waters. Edwards noted that the diversity of vessels was remarkable, ranging from purpose-built landing ships to converted merchantmen, from sleek destroyers to ungainly landing craft. What struck Edwards particularly was the newness of much of the American equipment. While the Royal Navy was operating many vessels that had been in service since the beginning of the war or even earlier, showing the wear and tear of years of combat operations, many American ships appeared fresh from the builders' yards. This reflected the timing of American entry into the war and the vast expansion of American shipbuilding capacity after 1941. Edwards also commented on the youth and enthusiasm of many American crews, contrasting them with the war weariness visible among some British personnel who had been in continuous service for years. Admiral Ramsay himself left relatively restrained official comments about the invasion fleet, reflecting his professional demeanour and focus on operational matters rather than emotional responses. However, in private correspondence and in post-war accounts by those who worked with him, it is clear that Ramsay recognized the operation's unprecedented scale. Ramsay had been present at the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940, when the Royal Navy and hundreds of civilian vessels had rescued more than 300,000 British and French troops from the beaches of northern France. That evacuation had been conducted under desperate circumstances, with the British Expeditionary Force facing annihilation. 4 years later, Ramsay was commanding a fleet that was not evacuating, but invading, not retreating, but advancing, and doing so with resources that exceeded anything available in 1940. The contrast must have been profound, though Ramsay was not given to theatrical expressions of emotion. British officers serving with naval bombardment forces had particular opportunities to observe the scale of Allied, including American, naval power. The Naval Gunfire Support Plan for D-Day called for a massive preliminary bombardment of German coastal defences. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would pound German positions with thousands of tons of high-explosive shells, attempting to suppress or destroy fortifications, artillery positions, and strongpoints before the troops landed. The Royal Navy contributed several battleships to this effort, including HMS Warspite and HMS Ramillies, both veterans of the First World War that had been modernized and pressed into service for another conflict. American battleships, including USS Texas, USS Arkansas, and USS Nevada, also participated. The Nevada was particularly notable, as she had been sunk during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, then raised, repaired, and returned to service, a testament to American determination and industrial capacity. Commander John Hughes Hallett, a Royal Navy officer who had been involved in planning amphibious operations and who had participated in the Dieppe raid, later wrote about observing the D-Day bombardment. Hughes Hallett noted that the volume of fire was immense, far exceeding anything seen during the Dieppe operation or during earlier amphibious landings in the Mediterranean. The combined Anglo-American naval gunfire support represented a concentration of firepower designed to overwhelm German defences through sheer weight of explosives. Hughes Hallett observed that the presence of American battleships, some of which had been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor and subsequently restored to service, was symbolically significant. These vessels represented not only American naval power, but also American resilience and the capacity to absorb losses and return stronger. British officers aboard vessels in the Eastern Task Force, responsible for landing British and Canadian troops at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, were able to observe elements of the Western Task Force heading for Utah and Omaha beaches. The segregation of task forces was not absolute, and vessels from different task forces often operated in proximity, particularly during the assembly phase when the entire armada was gathering in the channel. British observers noted the distinctive profiles of American landing ships and craft, many of which were designed to American specifications and differed in detail from British equivalents. The landing ship, tank, or LST, was a particularly important vessel type. These large, flat-bottomed ships could carry tanks, vehicles, and troops directly onto beaches, discharging their cargo through bow doors and ramps. Both Britain and the United States built LSTs, but American production far exceeded British output. The sight of columns of LSTs, their hulls painted in camouflage patterns, their decks crowded with vehicles and equipment, heading toward France was a tangible demonstration of Allied material superiority. Captain Anthony Myers, a Royal Navy submarine commander who had been awarded the Victoria Cross for actions earlier in the war, and who was serving in a staff position during Operation Neptune, later commented on the professionalism he observed among American naval personnel. Myers noted that while some British officers had initially harbored doubts about the combat readiness of American forces, those doubts had been largely dispelled by 1944. American forces had fought in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, gaining valuable combat experience. American naval forces had engaged in extensive operations in the Pacific against Japan and in the Atlantic against German U-boats. By the time of D-Day, American military forces were experienced, well-trained, and well-equipped. Myers observed that the cooperation between British and American naval forces during Neptune was generally smooth, with effective communication and coordination between units. The specialized vessels developed for the invasion also drew British attention and commentary. The Allies had created numerous unique vessel types and equipment specifically for Operation Overlord. These included the landing craft, tank, rocket, or LCTR, which could fire salvos of rockets to saturate beach defences just before troops landed. The LCTR was a British innovation, and British forces operated most of these vessels, but American industrial capacity produced many of the rockets themselves. Another British innovation was the Mulberry Artificial Harbour, a prefabricated portable harbour that could be towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches to facilitate the offloading of supplies and equipment. The Mulberry harbours were among the most ambitious engineering projects associated with D-Day, consisting of massive concrete caissons, floating roadways, and pierheads. American engineers contributed significantly to the construction of Mulberry components, even though the concept was primarily British. The Phoenix caissons, the concrete structures that formed the breakwaters for the Mulberry harbours, were built in British shipyards and construction sites, then towed to Normandy. The sight of these enormous concrete boxes being towed toward France was surreal, a demonstration of the extraordinary measures the Allies were taking to ensure the invasion's success. British liaison officers attached to American units and formations had particularly intimate views of American preparations and capabilities. These officers served as links between British and American commands, facilitating communication and coordination. Major General Kenneth Strong, a British intelligence officer who served as Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, worked closely with American officers throughout the planning process. Strong's memoirs and post-war accounts indicate that he developed great respect for the thoroughness of American planning and the scale of resources American commanders could call upon. Strong noted that while British and American approaches to military problems sometimes differed in emphasis and detail, the commitment to cooperation and the shared goal of defeating Nazi Germany overcame these differences. Strong was present at many of the key meetings and conferences leading up to D-Day, and he witnessed firsthand the interactions between British and American senior commanders, including Eisenhower, British General Bernard Montgomery, who commanded Allied ground forces for the invasion, Admiral Ramsey, and Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, who commanded Allied air forces. The relationship between Montgomery and his American counterparts was sometimes strained, reflecting both personality clashes and national sensitivities. Montgomery, who had achieved fame for his victory over German forces at El Alamein in North Africa in 1942, was confident in his own abilities and often dismissive of those he considered less competent. American generals, particularly Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who commanded the U.S. First Army for the invasion, and Lieutenant General George Patton, who would command the U.S. Third Army, were sensitive to any perceived British condescension. These tensions existed at the highest levels of command, but at the operational level, British and American officers generally worked effectively together. The success of D-Day depended on this cooperation, and both sides understood that failure to cooperate could result in disaster. The night of June 5, 1944, saw the invasion fleet depart from ports and anchorages across southern England and begin the journey across the Channel to Normandy. The original invasion date had been June 5th, but poor weather had forced Eisenhower to postpone for 24 hours. The decision to proceed on June 6th, despite continued marginal weather, was one of the most consequential of the war. If Eisenhower had postponed further, the next suitable combination of tides and moon phases would not have occurred until later in June, and the delay could have compromised the entire operation. The weather forecast, provided by Group Captain James Stagg, a British meteorologist, predicted a brief improvement in conditions on June 6th, and Eisenhower, after consulting with his commanders, made the decision to go. The fleet sortied into rough seas and overcast skies, with many troops suffering from seasickness during the crossing. British naval officers commanding their vessels during the crossing later described the experience as both awe-inspiring and nerve-wracking. The risk of German attack was ever present. German U-boats still operated in the Channel, and German aircraft based in France could potentially attack the fleet. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had been greatly weakened by years of attrition and by the overwhelming superiority of Allied air forces, but it still posed a threat. The Allied air forces, including the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, flew thousands of sorties on D-Day, providing air cover for the fleet and attacking German positions inland. German naval forces were limited, but E-boats, fast motor torpedo boats, operated from French ports and could threaten Allied shipping. The Royal Navy and US Navy deployed numerous destroyers and escort vessels to screen the invasion fleet against these threats. In the event, German naval and air attacks on D-Day were limited and ineffective, a testament to Allied air and naval superiority. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the invasion fleet arrived off the Normandy coast. The sight that greeted those who were topside was extraordinary. Thousands of vessels stretched across the sea as far as the eye could see. Battleships and cruisers took up positions to begin the bombardment. Landing craft circled in assembly areas, waiting for the signal to head for the beaches. Transport ships lowered their landing craft into the water, and troops clambered down cargo nets into the small boats. The noise was tremendous, with the roar of engines, the crash of naval gunfire, the scream of rockets, and the explosions of bombs and shells, creating a cacophony that participants described as overwhelming. The scale of the operation, visible in a way that it had not been when the fleet was dispersed across southern England, was now apparent to everyone involved. Lieutenant Commander Robert Franks, a Royal Navy officer commanding a destroyer providing fire support for the British landings, later wrote about the moment when he saw the full extent of the invasion fleet arrayed off the Normandy coast. Franks described feeling a sense of relief that the Allies had assembled such overwhelming force and a corresponding sense of pity for the German defenders who would face this onslaught. Franks noted that despite the inevitable casualties the Allies would suffer, and despite the fierce resistance expected from German forces, the outcome seemed foreordained given the disparity in resources. This was not overconfidence, but a realistic assessment based on the visible evidence before him. Franks also commented on the presence of American battleships firing in support of the landings, their guns hurling shells weighing more than a ton toward German positions miles inland. The power represented by these weapons was humbling, and Franks observed that the Germans had no equivalent capability to respond. British commandos and special forces units were among the first to land on D-Day, tasked with securing key objectives such as bridges, coastal batteries, and the flanks of the landing beaches. These units landed from specialized craft and often operated in close coordination with naval forces. The accounts left by commando officers include observations about the naval support they received. Lord Lovett, who commanded the 1st Special Service Brigade, landed on Sword Beach with his commandos, accompanied by his personal piper, who played as they stormed ashore. Lovett's mission was to link up with British airborne forces who had landed inland during the night to secure vital bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. Lovett later wrote about the confidence he felt seeing the massive fleet offshore and knowing that the Royal Navy and US Navy were providing support. Lovett's commandos successfully linked up with the airborne forces, achieving one of the key D-Day objectives. British airborne forces, the 6th Airborne Division, had dropped inland during the early hours of June 6th, before the seaborne landings began. Their mission was to secure the eastern flank of the invasion area, preventing German counterattacks from that direction. The paratroopers and glider-borne infantry fought with great skill and determination, capturing or destroying key objectives despite being scattered during the drop and facing determined German resistance. Officers of the 6th Airborne Division, upon linking up with seaborne forces later on D-Day or in the following days, expressed amazement at the scale of the invasion fleet and the volume of supplies and equipment flowing across the beaches. Major John Howard, who led the glider assault that captured the Caen Canal Bridge, later known as Pegasus Bridge, in the first minutes of D-Day, described watching ships arrive throughout the day, bringing reinforcements and supplies. Howard and his men had captured the bridge in a daring coup de main operation, landing their gliders within yards of their objective and overwhelming the German defenders in minutes. Holding the bridge until relieved required fierce fighting, but Howard knew that relief would come because of the massive forces being landed on the beaches. The American landings at Omaha Beach encountered the most serious difficulties of any of the D-Day beaches. The combination of strong German defences, difficult terrain, rough seas, and various tactical problems resulted in heavy American casualties and a situation that, for a time, appeared perilous. British observers, particularly those in naval vessels offshore, watched the unfolding crisis at Omaha with concern. Admiral Ramsay and other British officers were informed of the difficulties and offered assistance, but the situation was primarily an American responsibility under American command. By late morning and into the afternoon of June 6th, American forces at Omaha Beach, through extraordinary courage and determination, began to overcome the German defences and push inland. The crisis passed, though at a heavy cost. British officers who later learned the details of the Omaha Beach fighting expressed admiration for the resilience and bravery of the American troops who had prevailed despite the odds. In the days and weeks following D-Day, the Allied build-up in Normandy continued at an accelerating pace. The success of the invasion depended not only on getting ashore, but on bringing in supplies, reinforcements, and equipment faster than the Germans could bring up their reserves. The artificial Mulberry harbours, despite damage to the American Mulberry from a severe storm in mid-June, greatly facilitated this build-up. British commanders observed with approval the efficiency of American logistics and the sheer volume of material being landed. The United States was supplying not only its own forces, but also providing significant equipment and supplies to British and other Allied forces through Lend-Lease. American trucks, known as Jimmy or Deuce and a Half, were ubiquitous in Allied forces. American jeeps, tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft equipped units from multiple nations. This material support was crucial to sustaining Allied operations. The strategic and operational success of D-Day and the subsequent Normandy campaign vindicated the years of planning and the immense investment of resources. For British commanders, the experience confirmed both the necessity and the reality of the Anglo-American alliance. Britain could not have invaded and liberated Western Europe alone. The British Army, Royal Navy, and Royal Air Force were formidable fighting forces, battle-hardened and professional, but they lacked the sheer mass of resources required for an operation on the scale of Overlord. The United States provided that mass, bringing to bear industrial and military power that, combined with British experience and skill, created an irresistible force. British officers recognized this reality, even if it also represented a shift in the balance of power within the alliance and, more broadly, in the world. The comments and observations made by British commanders when they saw the D-Day fleet were not merely expressions of surprise at its size, though many were indeed surprised by the scale. These comments also reflected a complex mixture of emotions: relief that such power was on the Allied side, pride in British contributions to the operation, gratitude toward American allies, and perhaps some melancholy recognition that the Britain which had stood alone in 1940 was now the junior partner in an alliance dominated by American resources. These feelings were not often explicitly stated in official documents or public statements, but they can be discerned in private correspondence, in post-war memoirs, and in the accounts of those who knew these officers personally. Admiral Ramsay did not survive the war to see final victory, or to reflect at length on Operation Neptune in peacetime. He was killed in an aircraft accident in January 1945, while travelling to a meeting. His death was a significant loss, as Ramsay was one of the most capable naval commanders of the war. Those who served under Ramsay and who worked with him left accounts that emphasized his professionalism, his attention to detail, and his ability to manage the enormous complexities of Operation Neptune. Ramsay understood that the invasion fleet represented not just ships and equipment, but also the collective effort of millions of people in Britain, the United States, Canada, and other Allied nations. The fleet was a physical manifestation of Allied unity and determination. The success of D-Day set the stage for the liberation of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945. The invasion was not without its costs. Thousands of Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen died on June 6, 1944, and in the fighting that followed. The civilians of Normandy also suffered greatly, as their towns and countryside became a battlefield. The destruction wrought by the invasion and the subsequent campaign was immense. However, the alternative, a continued German occupation of Western Europe and a prolonged war, would have resulted in even greater suffering. The decision to invade and the execution of that invasion were justified by the outcome, though this does not diminish the sacrifice of those who fought and died. For British military commanders who witnessed the D-Day fleet, the experience was a defining moment in their lives and careers. They had participated in the largest and most complex military operation ever undertaken, an operation that succeeded despite the enormous challenges involved. The sight of thousands of ships stretching across the English Channel, carrying the hopes of millions for liberation and peace, was something that those who saw it never forgot. Their accounts, preserved in memoirs, letters, and official histories, provide valuable insight into the Allied effort during the Second World War and into the realities of coalition warfare. The cooperation between Britain and the United States during Operation Overlord, while not without tensions and disagreements, demonstrated what could be achieved when Allied nations worked together toward a common goal. This cooperation, forged in the crucible of war, would shape the post-war world and establish patterns of alliance that continue to the present day. The D-Day fleet was more than a collection of ships. It was a symbol of Allied unity,
determination, and the capacity of democratic nations to mobilize their resources and prevail against tyranny.